Okay, next up is going to be Janus and the Prince, a LitRPG Saga, The Nightmares of Alamir, book number 2, written by Naomi Oswin. It is 373 pages, $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. Cowards mock men. Idiots mock kings. But to mock a god, to stand at the precipice of paradise and damnation, and to open thy lips and denounce the divine as an ignorant existence, unworthy of their divinity. None would dare, none except him. For lip service to a deity, he is reborn as a creature whose belly scrubs the earth, reincarnating as a worm in the Janus that is Alamir. The man who spat in the face of a god turns and spits in the face of destiny. He ascends from battle and bloodshed to find favor in a witch of night just as mad, if not far madder than he. Baptized on the eve of the genocide of her people, he is bestowed the name Janus, as reborn with the power to explore the road not traveled, the power to eat his cake and have it, to split the timeline as he desires and pave his own path towards his chosen future. That chosen future awaits his bony, skeletal hands. War cometh for the defiant, war between cosmic horrors and unbesmirched apocalypse seekers and twisted messiahs, reincarnated madmen and avatars of extinction. And the man who defied God stands in the center. Hero, villain, monster, savior, king, slave, good or evil, all irrelevant when the nightmare of Alamir come midnight, wielding a dim lantern, rasping with the croaky voice as their unholy fingers rap against the door. Now tell the world, how shall you answer? That was a very interesting verse, and in its own way, it kind of trying to remind you about what this story is. And honestly, that's a problem, because when I started reading it, I did not remember either. If you haven't read book number 1, or it's been a super long time, I'm going to kind of summarize it. If you haven't, feel free to skip ahead of the review. But the first book in the series was a remonster story. Main character is reincarnated as a monster. In this case, he starts out as a worm, and he has to kill and level up his levels until he can evolve into the next higher form, which is based upon the things that he did in that life. Like what he killed, how he killed them, what skills he got, things like that, right? And so a lot of that first book is just a remonster, and it's a very entertaining story. Then as the main character finally attains his kind of skeletal form, the story expands into something a little more action adventurous, where the main character is a monster, and he's dealing with other monsters, and they're trying to take on the humans, and there's a whole storyline there. And starting in the beginning of this book, you kind of start out with the main character kind of at the peak of his OPness, on his overpoweredness from the end of book number 1. And then very quickly there's sort of a recap, but what I told you is basically better than what happened in the first 8%. But it took me a little while just to think about, what are these things that this is telling me? I can't remember the exact context of the story, one, because the first book came out so long ago, and also I read so many books in between. So it took me a good little while to try to just recall all the events of book number 1 and the power sets and why I was interested. But once I did, I was like, oh, that's right, I'm totally on board with this, and I had a really good time. I really did. But some people may not be willing to give it the effort if they can't recall what happened. But trust me, it makes sense. Power through the beginning a little bit, and you hopefully recall the things you liked about the story. For me, the main character, the thing I really enjoyed is just the fact that the main character is super willing to cheat, super willing to use any exploit he finds in the game mechanics to become powerful and to accomplish his goals. And he has the unique ability to split time so that he can explore and do things he wouldn't necessarily if his life was surely on the line. And essentially use as really well used exploit to gain extra power and loot and experience points and whatever else. And that was the aspect of the story that I recall enjoying the most, and it comes back in the story. in this particular second book in the series, there's not as much of the remonster stuff where the monster is evolving into species or new monster types. So there's a little bit of it, but it's not like the focus of the story anymore as it was in book number 1 necessarily. Instead, there's just like more straightforward action adventure, a little more plotted events, I think, a little bit. But again, most of the story is really just slice of life. Follow this character, he does a bunch of stuff, has some fights, does some interesting things to accomplish his goal. In this case, the big huge goal is like, oh, Earth is in trouble and it's going to be threatened, and so this guy has to try to save it by challenging the gods themselves. So it's a really big, plotted of like, oh, this can hopefully fill like 2, 3, 4 more books in his attempt to gain this much power. But the big draw again is that he's using his abilities intelligently to literally cheat and exploit the system any way he can to try to fight these higher powers. And so he's still overpowered relatively because of his abilities, but there are more challenges for him. There are more threats. There are things happening. I will warn you that there's a lot of cursing here, a lot of penis jokes, a lot of adult jokes and sex jokes in the story. So if that bothers you, don't read this. But again, it's adult humor. But it's not, it's adult stuff. But it's still entertaining. There's action adventure. There is a bit of a cliffhanger at the end of the story, which I was like, oh, I was like, well, okay, I guess. Still entertaining, had a good time with it. Overall, a fun story with an overpowered main character. Score of 7.4 to 10. Janus and the Prince, a LitRPG Saga, The Nightmares of Alamir, book number 2, with the score 7.4 out of 10.